Every community has legends about monsters and other creatures, real or imagined, who come out of nowhere to kidnap and devour the helpless that have been passed down from generation to generation, putting fear and dread in the minds of youngsters. They have been used as training instruments for a very long time. Of course, these tales are far more than urban legends. They serve as cautions against the horrific atrocities that wait in society for their next victim. In this instance, we are dealing with a murderer who inflicted unspeakable suffering and horror, and whose heinous deeds have prompted attempts to have all traces of him erased from the internet. The officers who worked on the case experienced persistent psychological problems as a result of the horrifying crimes. The one that follows is brutal. Before we get started, if you think this video is interesting, please give it a like at the conclusion and let me know what you think of the case. In favor of the channel. Also, remember to click subscribe for more. I'm grateful. August 17, 1971, on a barren farm in the Krasnodar region, Igor Erdashev's life was doomed from the start since his parents, who were both chronic alcoholics, were unable to give the young kid a nurturing atmosphere. Igor's mother continued to indulge in binge drinking episodes throughout her pregnancy. The consequence was a fragile and ill newborn. Igor had a heart and affection-free upbringing that was characterized by a never-ending struggle for existence. His parents' addiction was the cause of this. Igor's father abandoned the family when he was just 7 years old, leaving them to fend for themselves. Igor, when he was young, rarely attended school because it was not a priority for him. He was less than 10 years old when he had a terrible accident that altered the course of his life. He was in a vehicle accident, and the impact severely injured his brain, leaving him with a mild intellectual handicap that, according to his doctors, would never get better. As he fought to manage his newly discovered ailment, Igor's mother was forced to send him to a boarding school for kids with disabilities because of his increasingly unpredictable behavior. His mother severed relations with him once he was enrolled in school. She was no longer concerned about his welfare. Igor was now the only person on Earth. Igor found the boarding school to be a horrible and merciless environment where the older, more powerful students enjoyed torturing and brutally beating the helpless and defenseless boy. Igor was subjected to repeated beatings and unrelenting bullying because of his weak and skinny build, which made him an easy target for his attackers. The youngster suffered severe trauma and long-lasting agony as a result of the tormentor's callousness, which knew no bounds. With each day that passes, Igor's abuse exacerbated his precarious mental state, breaking his mind and spirit and trapping him in a loop of suffering and terror. Despite completing a carpentry program at a trade school and graduating from boarding school, Igor's hopes for a better life were abruptly dashed. His time as a carpenter was brief, and he was compelled to work at what he regarded as low-paying positions. To make ends meet, he worked as a milker, cleaner, and chef. Motivated by a desire to live a better life, he traveled to Moscow in the hopes of making a new beginning. Igor, however, who was unprepared and weak, found the harsh character of the city to be too much. He had trouble finding a job and frequently went without food while he lived on the periphery of society, unable to escape the harsh realities of his situation. Igor's depressing life had a glimpse of light in the early 1990s when he happened to meet a man with whom he fell in love. He was a conductor, and he completely altered his life. This newly made friend suggested that Igor leave Moscow and accompany him to St. Petersburg, where he set him up to work as a dishwasher in the Pegasus Cafe, which was well known in the gay community. However, the relationship was brief, and they soon split ways. Igor relocated to the little community of Metalostroy outside St. Petersburg in hopes of a fresh start after finding himself all alone once more. Igor quickly rose through the ranks at the Pegasus Cafe. He went from being a dishwasher to a bartender in a matter of months. Those who knew him characterized him as a beautiful man who always wore fashionable clothing and was egotistical, self-centered, and petty. Despite his attractiveness and charm, Igor's money was never sufficient to meet all of his needs. He became a male escort after accepting personal tasks from wealthy cafe guests out of a need for more money. His services were much sought after by guys who desired rough pleasures. Igor changed himself in order to attract customers, bleaching his hair and getting a chic haircut. Despite his hopes for some female customers, his only customers were guys, and this never happened. His evil cravings engulfed him more and more as his notoriety spread, replacing his once vulnerable mentality with an insatiable appetite for pleasure. Igor continues to indulge in increasingly heinous activities while feeding his clients twisted fantasies, despite the dangers. Later, he will assert that his clients frequently subjected him to brutal torture. Although escorting brought him a good income, sources indicate that he was the one who enjoyed torturing and inflicting pain on his clients, specializing in the most twisted and repulsive forms of mutual pleasure. Over time, the role-playing games also stopped satisfying the young man's sadistic inclinations. He was really a predator in his truest form. He started to roam the streets in search of minors who met his bizarre criteria for outward signs of vulnerability, bringing them into his grasp with the pretense of love and protection. Igor's choice of victims was motivated by a cruel inclination that was both spontaneous and planned, claims police officer Andrei Kubarev. When he came across a helpless and weak person, he already knew what he would do with them. Igor felt convinced that he could defeat his victim and had no qualms about picking them as his target. He was only interested in finding someone who was much less strong than him. While Igor was strolling through Pine Park in December 1993, 3 schoolchildren, all of whom were 11 years old, caught his attention. The incident took place in the city of St. Petersburg. He approached the kids with a knife after making sure there were no adults in the area. 2 brothers were held captive by one of the kids who later ran away. The lads were then made to drink alcohol by Igor, who then viciously raped them before abandoning the scene. Later, the victims characterized their attacker as a young man between the ages of 20 and 25, with a slender physique, an effeminate voice, and blonde hair. Igor evaded capture despite a furious police hunt, generating panic and indignation in the neighborhood. Igor stayed hidden for a month following the Pine Park assault. He worked as a server during the day and served customers at night. But in February 1994, he embarked on a new crime. Igor had the day off that particular day, so he began drinking early in the day. The forensic analysis revealed that the 9-year-old boy had been violently assaulted and died from asphyxiation later that day, on Saturday when his lifeless corpse was found in the corridor of his apartment complex. The fact that the murder took place in the hallways of the young victim's own home frightened and outraged the neighbors. The investigators theorized that the attacker may have ambushed the youngster in the elevator or on the stairs, assaulted him, and then strangled him with his bare hands. However, despite intensive inquiries, no one saw the horrible assault, and no one was watching nearby on the day of the crime. The investigators thoroughly investigated all of the area's registered offenders, but they were unable to uncover any information that would have assisted them in cracking the case. Igor would later acknowledge that he did not intend to kill the youngster, but that his extreme intoxication prevented him from controlling himself. 3 months later, in May 1994, St. Petersburg saw another disturbing occurrence when a 10-year-old boy was viciously attacked in a building on Ruse Avenue. The youngster said that a man approached him close to the stairs and persuaded him to go up to the attic to witness some nesting birds. When the youngster realized there were no birds up there once he was inside, Igor choked him until he passed out. Then he insisted on being with him. Then, using his bare hands, he tore out his crotch region after sticking his fingers into his rectum. After the bleeding child managed to descend from the attic, nearby apartment dwellers saw him and dialed for help. Although medical professionals were able to preserve his life, the attack left him permanently crippled. The suspect's description matched that provided by the victims of the first attack in Pine Park in December 1993. The unsettling episode put the neighborhood in fright, and there were rumors that a killer might be on the loose. The public was urged to provide any information that could identify the offender in response to the authorities' plea. Igor savagely assaulted 2 young boys, ages 11 and 12, while threatening them with a knife on the normally quiet banks of the Neva River. Between the river pier and the Volodusky Bridge, where the assault occurred, Igor led the boys to a desolate area. Another young, thin, blonde man with a high-pitched voice who matched the description of the previous cases served as the assailant. Investigators made the assumption that the assailant was either unemployed or worked shifts at night, because all of the assaults occurred on workdays between 12 and 6 p.m. The police searched numerous gay nightclubs for a person with the aforementioned traits, but their search was fruitless. Parents feared for the safety of their children as the neighborhood fell into a state of terror and despair, while reports of a predator on the loose persisted. The government broadcast a warning to the people to be cautious and watchful. However, the citizens of St. Petersburg took matters into their own hands rather than waiting for the police to catch the offender. In addition to advising their kids about the hazards of the streets, parents took time off work to accompany their kids to and from school. Every member of the community was on edge, and fear and uncertainty pervaded the city. Despite mounting demands and widespread attention, Igor continued to stalk the streets in search of his next victim, unfazed by the opposition to his sick plans. As the neighborhood prepared for the next attack, the hunt for the predator became more intense. Since Igor had seen a 16-year-old boy going down the street in September 1994, they didn't have to wait very long. Igor had observed that, as a result of St. Petersburgers' vigilance, it was more difficult to locate younger victims. He had to try someone slightly older as a result. He started to pursue this young man through the neighborhood before entering his apartment building. Along with him, Igor enters the elevator. Igor then hit the young man in the face as soon as the door closed to start the attack. To his amazement, the young man, however, was not intimidated, and he retaliated. They fought until the elevator reached the desired floor and the doors opened. When they did, the young man raced outside and began pounding on the doors of the apartments, alerting everyone that the murderer was present. Igor ran away swiftly out of fear. However, as soon as he was out on the street, he began to be excited about what had just transpired. As opposed to being the cold-blooded predator that he is, he instantly started seeking his next victim, which he found very quickly. He was a 9-year-old boy who rang his building's buzzer after returning from school. The youngster's building was astonishingly located right across the street from where Igor had just left after his previous attack. But he wasn't bothered by this. He was in the moment when the boy's mother buzzed the door open and allowed him in, but no one saw the man sneaking in behind him. The same event as before took place. Igor and the small youngster on the elevator. The attack started as soon as the doors opened. The child was choked by Igor until he blacked out. He then ascended to the top floor on the elevator. He then carried a young boy into the utility room, where the vicious assault started. Igor ripped the boy's crotch open with his fingers pushed into his rectum, before slowly beginning to rip out more than 8 meters of an incredibly repulsive act. After delivering the intended terror, Igor took the boy's school bag and left the area. At this point, the mother began looking for her son. She was concerned because she had only anticipated him staying for a short while. She was starting to panic, so she asked the neighbors whether they had seen him. After regaining consciousness, the child used all of his remaining power to crawl back to his residence. When his mother came back, she discovered him on the floor, bloodied and frail. She was terrified by her son's condition and called an ambulance right away because his life was in danger and his prognosis wasn't good. They were able to stabilize him after 6 hours of surgery. Despite the boy's severe injuries, an artificial intestinal transplant might yet be able to save him, but it would be expensive and only be available in the United States. Fortunately, the American experts who would perform the procedure offered their expertise without charge. Even so, there were still a lot of costs to pay for, including transportation, lodging while in the hospital, and food and medical supplies, which came to about $500,000 in all. Courtesy of compassionate people who were made aware of the boy's predicament, he was able to travel to America for the transplant with his mother and grandmother thanks to a remarkable amount of money that was raised in just 10 days. Over the course of 6 years, the medical team performed around 30 rounds of artificial intestinal transplantation in an effort to save the boy's life. Unfortunately, before the subsequent surgery could be finished, the boy passed away in the year 2000. The attack did provide some consolation. Investigators interviewed numerous prospective witnesses after finding fingerprints at the crime scene. A young woman who saw the culprit that day and smelled the popular black drive-in lotion, which was an aftershave in the mid-1990s, was one of them. A 16-year-old youngster who had successfully resisted Igor also assisted the cops in drawing a thorough sketch of the culprit. The sketch was then published in newspapers, broadcast frequently on national television, and distributed as a flyer around St. Petersburg. When Igor himself watched this on television, he realized he was probably going to be discovered soon. He escaped to Murmansk, where he changed the color of his hair and sought refuge with a friend in order to avoid being apprehended. However, his friend quickly asked him to go, so this did not last long. Without any other options, he returned to St. Petersburg. He was skeptical at first, but after a while he sensed that the terror had passed and he was free to walk around the city. He was able to make ends meet by spending the evenings in the houses of his clients, who fed him and gave him some cash. He continued doing this until one of the men he was lodging with discovered a bloody bag that was unmistakably a child's. He did not, however, firmly believe that Igor was the assassin everyone was searching for. Even so, he reported his discovery to the police. Igor was promptly located at the home where the bug was detected and taken into custody. The suspect initially refused to assist the detectives, but as time passed, more and more evidence started to point to his guilt. He discovered that his fingerprint was discovered at the crime scene and that several victims had recognized him as their assailant. Aside from that, he was unable to explain why the victim's blood had gotten on his shoes. In an effort to deceive the police, "I really love cats," he said. "There were usually a lot of them, despite the fact that I attended a boarding school throughout my upbringing. I adore and value affection, and I am quite affectionate." The suspect changed his stance after initially denying any connection and feigning to be mentally ill. He will frequently cry for no apparent reason in an effort to show investigators that he is insane. Only a person who was insane, in his opinion, could have perpetrated these crimes. Igor asked to be sent to a psychiatric hospital for the rest of his life to receive care. Igor attempted to fool the skilled psychiatrist, who concluded that he was mentally sound, but he was unsuccessful. He was consequently turned away from the treatment center. Igor endured a protracted wait for his trial, as no attorneys wanted to stand up for him. That much contempt was directed at his behavior. He continued to scream and cry while he was imprisoned, trying to convince people of his insane state, but to no avail. The other detainees had given the order to shoot him dead on sight. He was the #1 opponent of the people at this point. When his trial did finally begin, it was conducted behind closed doors since his parents and the broader public wanted to lynch him, if they could only capture him. It came as no great surprise that he was swiftly awarded the death penalty and transported to the notorious colony. However, the death penalty was suspended over time. He was not executed as a result. However, given the ongoing suffering and unfavorable living conditions for inmates, it could be argued that he was in the colony, which was worse than death. Throughout his stay in the colony, he would shout or laugh hysterically for hours at a time, torturing other prisoners with his antics. He occasionally cries for days on end. He would frequently be caught staring at a wall if he wasn't doing this. Igor was deemed sane when he was imprisoned, according to the colony's leader, but as time goes on, everything changes. At times you can hardly understand a word he says. Igor's cynicism and nastiness, according to one of the cops, were unfathomable even in relation to everyone else. This individual would have realized that it was impossible to leave his victims alive sooner or later, and there would have been a long line of dead bodies. Who knows, maybe they would have grown even more horrifying. Despite the extreme brutality of this case, things may have been worse. This concludes this episode. Until then, be careful.